Hi there, my name is Asha Jenkins and I'm a research assistant with the Centre for Political Thought at the University of Exeter, and I'm also a DPhil International Relations candidate at the University of Oxford. We're joined today by Professor Thomas Risse, Professor of International Relations at the Free University of Berlin, to speak about his recent book titled Effective Governance Under Anarchy, co-authored by Tanja Börzel. Challenging traditional conceptions of the state and its role within the international system, Effective Governance Under Anarchy focuses on the possibilities and effectiveness of governance in areas of limited statehood. In today's interview, we'll delve further into the book's themes, the process of researching the topic, and Professor Risse's academic background more generally. And we're also joined today by Professor Alex Pritchard as a co-interviewer, who's an associate professor of international relations at the University of Exeter. So thank you both for being here today, and especially to you, Thomas, for being our interviewee and speaking to us about your recent publication.
Thanks for having me.
Thanks. So to begin, I'll ask two questions on your background and your recent publication before Alex turns to some more specific questions related to the content of the book and also the project more generally. And so to begin on a general note, I wonder if you could tell us a little bit about your academic background and your research interests, in particular, your interests in transnational governance and on limited statehood, and perhaps give us some insights into how you came to study this topic.
Yeah, okay, so academic background first. So I have degrees in political science, so I did my PhD in Germany at Frankfurt. Then after that, I went to the US. This is the late 80s, early 90s. So the end of the Cold War, I actually experienced in the US and not in Germany. And then in the early 1990s, I came back to Germany, to the University of Konstanz, where I was teaching international relations. From there on, I went to Florence, Italy, to the European University Institute, also in had a chair on international relations. And then for the past, 22 years, I've been at Freie Universität Berlin. So that's pretty much the academic background. Now, you asked for my research interest, which is probably a bit more interesting than, recording my CV. But so in a way, I got interested in transnational relations, i.e. in the international relations of non-state actors, more than 30 years ago. All right, so I was particularly looking at transnational social movements, so-called advocacy networks and the like. And at about the same time, this is now the early 1990s, I also became interested in international human rights. I have a kind of human rights background, when I did my high school exam at that time, I was engaged engaged with Amnesty International, so I was always interested in these type of topics. But then the research interest in human rights referred particularly in countries what is now called, I think erroneously, because it's a bad expression, Global South. We don't know a better expression for this, but it's a whole variety of countries. But this interest in Global South countries then resulted 10 years later, and now we are in the early 2000s, in some broader work on the governance problematic in countries where the state is too weak to enforce central decisions or the law. And that includes cases in which the state has actually lost its monopoly of use of force. And this is what we call areas of limited statehood. One has to say, though, this also includes countries that never had any effectively functioning state to begin with. The whole failed state problematic always assumes that countries had effective states all the time, and then somehow, they lost it. And that is simply wrong. Many countries never had a kind of Western style effective state to begin with. This concerns large parts of sub-Saharan Africa. Afghanistan is a typical case, but also many Southeast Asian countries. So that's the kind of how I got into what is now the topic of that latest book.
Great, thank you. And turning to that book, I wonder if you could tell us a little bit about the project that you undertook. And you mentioned in the preface of the book that this publication is a result of a period of research that spans over 10 years, involves many scholars in collaboration with postdoctoral fellows and PhD students. So I wonder if you could tell us a little bit about the difficulties and excitement of conducting such a large collaborative project, and what you regard as its main findings.
Okay, these are two questions now. On the first, so we started thinking about a collaborative. It's called in certain Germany. It's called Sonderforschungsbereich, or a collaborative research center. We already started thinking about this in 2003 or so. We then got funding from 2006 to 2017 for 12 years altogether. And you know, the book we're talking about only came out in 2021. So you can see that's a very long period of time. And I'm extremely grateful for the German Research Foundation, the Deutsche Forschungsgemeinschaft, that actually funds these type of schemes. Okay, so as you said, it involved many PhD researchers, essentially 3 generations of PhD researchers. You know, in each funding period, we hired a new cohort of PhD researchers. We had many postdocs, and now a lot of these people are professors at universities. They work for think tanks, for some development organizations, and so forth. So it's really a privilege to have that kind of funding. Now you ask for the difficulties. Of course, it's kind of herding a whole group of cats, right? So that's, you know, your principal investigators, usually professors, are not the easiest people to deal with many times. But I mean, the prospect of funding always gets people then to come back collaborating. And in fact, we had a tremendous experience. And the advantage of this is you can really concentrate on a big topic rather than, you know, a little thing, and you can pursue that topic for 10 or more years. Yeah, and that is an enormous privilege, you know. So I think that was the point. You can't simply tackle this as a single researcher, right? So now you asked about the main results. So I think one can summarize this very briefly. First of all, I mean, I've introduced the concept of areas of limited statehood already. So to put it this way, if the state is weak, it's not the end of the world as we know it. Okay, so governance, what we call governance, is possible even under very dire circumstances. In fact, and this is this governance, effective governance under anarchy, in terms of public service provision in health, education, economic subsistence, even in human rights, is possible under anarchy. A whole variety of local, national, and transnational actors are involved in governance provision. And we have also identified pretty much 3 conditions of effective governance under these circumstances. The first one is, and this is a fundamental condition, relationships of social trust among peoples and elites. This goes a very long way as a kind of functional equivalent to an effective state. If people trust each other, they can do a lot of things together, including providing governance. Secondly, those governing, you know, I don't want to call them government because government is always identified with the states, but I'm talking about governors that can be all kinds of people, community-based organizations, local leaders, international organizations, NGOs, etc. But they need to fulfill one condition. and that is they need to have some sort of legitimacy. That is, the citizens have to bestow them what one could call the license to govern. If they're not legitimate, they face serious problems. And that is actually happening. That is what happened, by the way, to the international community in Afghanistan over time. You know, and that then led to these tragic events there. The third conditions is something, you know, you need governance institutions that are kind of fit for purpose. All right. They need to be designed and adapted to local circumstances. There is no one-size-fits-all institution for governance. You know, give you an example. Let's talk about healthcare and public health. Some tasks are relatively easily to administer. For example, child immunization is easy, right? You need to have some doctors, you have medicine, and you have to collect the kids. That's it. Now, if we look at other tasks in public health, for example, think COVID, think HIV/AIDS or something. This requires very complex health institutions, hospitals that are actually capable to deal with this, but also education institutions, etc. So these are very, very complex tasks, you know, and the institutions have to be fit for that particular purpose.
Great, thank you. I think we'll turn to Alex now for a few of his questions.
And these are fascinating topics. I suppose one of the criticisms is that, you know, traditionally at least, or historically, this study of sort of failed state or non-state actors is often taken on a very sort of Eurocentric frame. And this is often a criticism that's leveled at people who do study the liberal peace and post-conflict reconstruction. I just wondered whether you'd reflected on that. I know it's in the book. I was just wondering if you could reflect on that for us to explain some of the tensions that might have arisen there, and then what sort of ethical and methodological challenges you think you've been able to resolve through this project.
Okay, again, these are two questions, I take it. So let me tackle Eurocentrism first. I mean, in our case, and this is why we call the concept of limited statehood, we can discuss for ages how that came about. But the one thing is most of the research on these type of areas of limited statehood was for a long time wedded to this failed state terminology. And I mentioned that already, which has this idea that there are states that somehow went kaput, right? that kind of collapse, etc. And that is a very Euro and Western-centric notion, because then lacking state capacity is somehow viewed as a factual or even sometimes moral deficiency. You know, failed states are bad, must be bad. And this is actually, if you look at the data sets about so-called failed states, they're usually a deficit list, right? And they usually conflate state incapacity or lack of effective governance with governance deficiency. And I think we can show that this is not the case. Rather, we see huge variation with regard to effective governance in areas of limited statehood. And the problem is that this kind of Western centrism also assumes then that only fully functioning Western type barbarian states can deliver the goods. And that leads to this state building paradigm that resulted in a huge failure over the last 20 years. You know, where you had a kind of blueprints for state institutions, and you know, the Germans started to sell their model of a federal state with regions to the rest of the world that never had regions, or where that wouldn't work, or there were all kinds of blueprints. How do you do a constitutional court, etc. And you try to spread this around the world, and then of course it fails because it doesn't meet local conditions. So this Eurocentrism and Western centrism not only led us to ask the wrong questions, but also to give the wrong answers. and that had real political implications. You also asked for the ethical and methodological challenges. Now, I mean, one thing is that our research involved a lot of field research in areas of limited statehood, and including interviews, participant observations. Some people did ethnographic studies, and as a result of which, you run into exactly the kind of ethical and methodological challenges that kind of research entails. You know, if, for example, you interview people in some rural areas, you have to be very careful to treat them as subjects and not just objects of your research. You know, the Western white researcher pops in and then disappears, right? So there are these kind of issues involved. You need to take people seriously. You need to take seriously their own knowledge, etc., etc. Another challenge, of course, and this is on the part of our researchers. I mean, some of the research involved war zones. We did research in Afghanistan. Fortunately, there we had a very experienced researcher who could function under these circumstances. But I mean, it is an ethical challenge to send, let's say, PhD researchers in war zones. That's where research is, under some circumstances, simply not possible. You know, so we had to call. Actually, we had in some instances we had to call them back because you have some responsibility for your researchers. So there are these issues involved. You know.
So if you pull back, and I'm going to ask a couple of theoretical questions now. So if you pull back and start thinking then about how this matters for, let's say, political theory and IR more broadly, can you sort of unpack, you know, the problems with state centrism that you think this project engaged, and how you think that this moves those sorts of debates on, perhaps? I mean,
in a way, I talked about this already in the previous answer. I mean, one problem with the state centrism, it is kind of behind that, of course, as I said, is a particular notion of the fully functioning barbarian state, which is actually in the world system a kind of exception to the rule. Yeah, so you overlook phenomena that your particular paradigmatic lens doesn't show, and then you get into this deficit theory. Worse, it is is wedded to particular modernization paradigm with regard to the so-called global south. You know, you need number one, you need economic growth, development, and number two, you need a fully functioning state. And then there's a whole debate starting in the 1960s already, which has to come first. The fully functioning state, and then economic growth, or economic growth, and then the fully functioning state. But the whole modernization paradigm is, as Steve Kastner put it once, you know, once you put the state and the people on an elevator, you know, they all go into modernization, and the rest is Denmark, or any kind of well-functioning Western type of state. And that has, as I said before, led to kind of recipes for disaster in many development programs. You know, Afghanistan is a case in point, but there are also numerous attempts to fix states in sub-Saharan Africa. I mean, one of my favorite examples is always the really failed state of Somalia. You know, Somalia has been a failed state now for more than 30 years. But if you look at the country, there are various provinces. There's one province where the capital is Mogadishu, and that's a war zone. That's when we hear Somalia, we think it's a war zone. There are all kinds of terrorist groups, militias, what have you. And it's true concerning Mogadishu. There's another province called Somaliland. That's actually an effectively almost a quasi-state, if you want, that rests on exactly the kind of conditions that I have just outlined. There's a lot of social trust. There are a lot of so-called traditional leaders, kind of the governors that are trusted by the population. There are a lot of non-state justice institutions, not state courts. There are no state courts to be seen, and they can deliver. They can actually deliver justice under certain circumstances. So coming back to the state centrism, that is always overlooked. And then again, if you translate that into political programs, all you do is essentially you destroy local governance institutions and wonder afterwards why your recipes do not work. You know.
I mean, so I mean, what you're describing, of course, from mainstream political science and IR point of view, is sort of an anarchy, essentially, right? And of course, the title of the book is Anarchy in Areas of Limited Governance. And so so the question is really, I mean, given that most of IR for the last, I don't know, well, certainly since the 50s, has been trying to move beyond anarchy or to tame anarchy or to transcend anarchy through some historical process. What you seem to be saying is that anarchy is our lot, if you like. This is it, right? So why do you say that? And so what can we take from that analytically, conceptually, for theorizing order in world politics?
No, it's interesting that you mentioned mentions international relations as a discipline, and indeed, international relations is preoccupied with the anarchy problematic. And you have, I mean, very broadly, very broadly defined two kind of almost paradigmatic approaches to all of this. One is it's a dog-eat-dog world, Hobbesian, you know, it's a state of nature. And everything is chaos, and you can have limited peace if you have a balance of power system, etc. This is usually what is called the realist paradigm, which is still alive and kicking for some reasons. But then there's also a totally other paradigm, call it the institutionalist paradigm, and that was thinking systematically now for decades how you can have cooperation under anarchy, what we call governance under anarchy. Yeah, even in 1986, Ken Oy published his famous book, Cooperation Under Anarchy, in which he specified conditions under which states without a world state, and that is not in the cards, even though some people always dream of a world state, and I always think that's a nightmare. You don't want to have such a thing on the world level, you know. It can only be autocratic, you know. That's the only way you can think about this. So, so in that sense, IR theorists of that institutionalist paradigm have thought about cooperation under anarchy now for 30, 40 years, you know, and there are various approaches, you know, some rational choice, some not so much, more constructivist, etc., more sociological. So in that sense, IR scholars have always had to face this anarchy problematic, but they have come up with solutions, how you can have effective governance under anarchy. And in a way, what we did with the book was simply use, I mean, not explicitly, but at least implicitly, part of these theories to think about the domestic level. You know, that in IR terms is always hierarchical. There's a functioning state and we don't think about it. And we say, no, that's not the case. In fact, areas of limited statehood to a large extent resemble the international system. So why not using approaches that think about how you can govern under anarchy in the international system, how you can actually apply this to areas of limited statehood inside countries. You know.
I mean, I think all of this is absolutely fascinating. It's a tremendous book and an absolutely epic, ambitious project. Yeah. You know, this should be required reading, I think, and I've really enjoyed reading it, and it's been great to talk to you too. I'll hand over to Astrid again now.
No, that's great. I mean, I was just going to offer a similar conclusion, thanking you for your insights on the book, on what Alex says is a massive project, with, I'm sure, a lot of interesting insights for IR theory and practice as well. So thank you so much for your time. And
Thank you for asking all these great questions.
Great. Thank you very much.
Thanks.
Thank you.